When his father passed away, he left him 30 slaves. By the time Jefferson passed away, he had 600. But Jefferson also wrote such aggressive anti-slave language in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence that the Continental Congress actually voted to remove it before they sent it to King George III. But and on top of that, I mean, he was a strict constitutionalist who didn't believe the president should be able to buy land.
Hang on,
he
wait a
bought
minute.
the largest piece of land in U.S. history. And
Hold on a second. What did you say about the anti-slavery language? Didn't the UK already outlaw slavery at this point?
yeah, and this is probably something to be fact checked on here, but I believe they were already in the process of outlawing slavery in England itself. But there was still slave practice all throughout the British Empire at this point.
So he wrote something so aggressive that the country that was trying to unwind from it thought it was too much.
Well, the Continental Congress voted to not even include it in the Declaration of
They were afraid
Independence.
that this would offend them. Or
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good way to word that guy. I like that. One of the things that when going through this research and looking through, Jefferson's life and, drafting up, we don't follow scripts on this show, but drafting up, kind of the most important parts to make sure we cover on here, is that it's one contradiction after the other with him. And I think, the lazy man psychologist would probably say that, he's just a hypocrite.
Right.
Which is probably, I want to say that was my opinion before I started this. It certainly was a little bit, because I didn't like how he dealt with my boy John. But the more I came to appreciate the complexity of it, and I think a lot of our view on Jefferson comes, from a historical standpoint, comes from that we elevated the Founding Fathers to these, like, ideas, a viewpoint of ideas, right? That these were great men it was weird to challenge them as
deified them.
exactly that they possessed some sort of infallibility, and then as we matured as a nation, a lot of the stuff those founding fathers did, especially somebody like Jefferson, really kicked the can down the road. And Jefferson wrote a lot about in his life. I mean, he published many books and long form essays. And it's funny because he clearly knew this was going to be an issue. He saw the Civil War coming 60, 70, 80 years before it did. And I think these weren't men of, infallibility. These weren't men of these weren't philosophers, right? Mm-hmm. These were farmers, right? These were politicians. These were generals. They knew they weren't operating in a perfect world. And they tried to make the best decision they could, knowing the challenges. And to be honest, the things they couldn't cure in society. Mm-hmm. And then we look back 200-300 years later and we go, why didn't they see that coming? Well, if it's choosing between being a unified nation or addressing the slave issue, which virtually nobody else in the world at this point had addressed anyways, well, you got to make a tough choice. And we view them on these pedestals. These men didn't at the time. And I think over time we've shaped our view of Jefferson. And we've come to accept that there is some hypocritical aspects of him. And I think, personally, if you compare it to John Adams, it looks even more stark. It looks even more extreme. But yeah, so we're going to cover, I know, like Kyle said, the first episodes usually talk about them as a person, try and, make them into somebody we can relate to. And luckily, we have a good amount of information on Jefferson's early life, which we didn't really have with Washington, and wasn't super interesting with Adams.
Why is that? Why do we have so much more information on Jefferson? It's just better family that he came from. That
so much money.
Yeah.
Oh my word, so much money he had. He was the 1% of the 1% in the colonies. He wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was born with a gold spoon in his mouth. He is not Jefferson and Adams. Like, he's not son of a farmer, son of a planter who was going to work his whole life. Oh, no. That was not this man.
So, speaking of Britain trying to abolish slavery, it was 1883 when they finally did abolish that. Thank you, Laura.
Ooh, that is late.
Yeah, that's after we did it.
What's newer, the telephone or slave-free England?
Right.
I think the last country to outlaw
Not
slavery was East Timor. And I think that was like within our lifespan.
Was that like 2005?
Yeah, it was early enough to where it was a problem.
Could have a smartphone, I think.
Yeah. Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. Born April 13th, 1743 in Shadwell, Virginia, Jefferson was a lawyer, a planter, and a revolutionary thinker who became one of the Founding Fathers' brightest stars, one of their most complicated. Jefferson burst onto the national stage as the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, serving as a poetic ode to liberty while conveniently sidestepping the whole owning humans situation. He later became governor of Virginia, guiding the state through the chaos of the Revolutionary War, and served as George Washington's first Secretary of State, where he sparred with Hamilton over just about everything. Literally everything. He actually got Jefferson to step down. By the time Jefferson snagged the presidency in 1801 at 57, he cemented his reputation as a champion of small government, low taxes, agrarian utopia, yeoman farmers' rule of land, and his presidency was a mixed bag of brilliant missteps. On one hand, he pulled off the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the United States for a bargain price. He sent out the Lewis and Clark expedition. On the other hand, the Embargo Act wasn't too great, really damaged the economy. Jefferson's personal life only added to his mystique and controversy. Married to Martha, who died young, leaving him heartbroken and the sole parent of their surviving children. And then there was Sally Hemmings, an enslaved woman at Monticello, with whom Jefferson likely fathered several children with. His messy legacy historians are still unpacking. And after retiring in 1809 and retreating to Monticello, where he dabbled in architecture, science, and the founding of the University of Virginia, his life finally came to an end on July 4th, 1826, fittingly on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
And a couple hours before John Adams passed away.
His last thing was making John Adams incorrect, which was probably one of his favorite things. I gotta imagine when Adams got to heaven, he probably was like, "You had to make me wrong in my last statement."
Right.
No, so Mr. Kyle, where do you want to begin on this?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, personal life. We you kind of talked a little bit about his beginnings. Like, where did the family money come from? Like, how did the family gain notoriety? Why was he in position to be where he was at the time?
Yeah. So his parents, Peter and Jane Jefferson. His dad was a successful planter, and for a running theme on this show, a surveyor.
Okay, those were high demand.
High demand back then. Yeah, I gotta respect it. So there's a lot of not like again, like I always struggle because I always want to say contemporary pieces, but these pieces written in like the late 1700s, early 1800s, which was obviously well after Peter Jefferson passed away. So they're not just because something's old doesn't make it contemporary. That's one of those big things in history and economics we talk a lot about. For some reason, a lot of like primary sources will remark on his physical strength. Like Peter Jefferson was like apparently just swole. Like, imagine being so jacked, people write about it like hundreds of years afterwards.
Oh, dude, but you know, he's the guy who's inviting people over to his house and then like bending iron bars in front of him. Like, they're writing about it because he's making sure they know about it.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, no, okay. That's definitely what it was. He wanted to be known. It's kind of like when we were talking about people getting painted in portraits, and it was like, oh, you made them look nice, right? You don't make the guys paying you a year's wage look bad.
He's the one who took his shirt off before he did it. He's the modern day Instagram.
wait till we get to Theodore Roosevelt. We'll talk about it a little bit. Hilarious feats of strengths.
Oh yeah, that's right.
He had a lazy eye because he got in a boxing match with like a professional boxer at the White House.
Trying to wrestle a bear too at some point?
Probably. I think that sounds very reasonable for Theodore Roosevelt. So a lot of their success, a lot of the family money came originally from Jane. So Jane was from like the most prominent family in pretty much in all of the colonial Virginia, but also from England itself that immigrated over. So he was born with a gold spoon in his mouth. If we're being honest, like he had two incredibly affluent parents. His father passed away young, and I know one of the things we often talk about is making sure we understand like. These people are humans, right? Like, nobody wants to lose their dad at 14. His dad left him 5,000 acres with 30 slaves. I mean, they left him an economic juggernaut. And so as we mentioned in the reading, that Shadwell was the plantation he grew up on. It's near modern-day Charlottesville, Virginia, just to give people kind of an idea of where it is. Now, Peter Jefferson, he's a surveyor planter. He was also he dabbled in cartography. Just used to make maps.
Right.
Thought that was I like maps. I included that.
That sounds like a useful hobby. Like if you wanted to, if you liked making maps, then you should probably come to the New World.
Yeah, right. Even today, geography is one of has one of the highest employment rates of
Really?
like any degree. Yeah. Jane, Jefferson's mom, she was from the Randolph family. Like I said, one of the most elite families in all Virginia. Basically, like nobody worked in the family. It was all planters and plantation owners.
Another interesting commonality I'm starting to notice is it seems like a lot of the people who had money got it from the women that they married.
Yeah, yeah.
The exception of
Martha?
maybe Adams.
Abigail,
Yeah, right?
and Jane so
Yeah.
far. So yeah, no, you're right. Key to success is having a mom who's smart with money and from an affluent family. Who would have thunk it? So Jefferson was the third of 10 children. So he had big family, just like a lot of the founding fathers had. What I think is kind of cool is that whole like area he grew up in, that Albemarle County.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's named after where his mom's from. Which I gotta believe that's a different level of social hierarchy and affluency if you come from England and they name where you move to after where you have the power to just be like, I want to start a new place. Like if I just moved like to California, it's like New Quincy. It's like, oh, that's
Right.
Just some sway to do that. But yeah, so Shadwell
New Wales,
just set the scene.
New Wellington.
Shadwell was in the Blue Ridge Mountains, just to give you like an idea of where he grew up. So
That's gorgeous, dude.
yeah, it really is. It's literally looks like my wife's from that area, and it looks like a painting when you're driving. You're like, wow,
Right.
That is unbelievable. So from a young age, like his parents knew that Jefferson was going to be an aristocrat, and so they start educating him very young. Unlike the other founding fathers, where education was certainly a focus, but they came from I'd say like upper middle. I would argue that George Washington didn't come from the upper middle class. I would argue that George Washington was probably better defined as working class if we had to equate it to modern standards. John Adams came from from an educated family. I don't want to say overly well educated or overly prominent, but he came from a well established family. It wasn't until he married Abigail that it really saw a social increase.
Right.
Jefferson's the opposite. Jefferson's family, he was basically told from a young age his job is to be, an intelligent, well-rounded individual who needs to be able to have managerial experience to be able to run the plantation when his dad died. But he was taught the Greeks. He was taught Latin, history.
True Renaissance man.
True Renaissance man. One of the terms you may hear us say throughout like this dialogue, because it was very prominent in Jefferson's life, and if somebody like gets really interested and goes back and wants to read more about Jefferson's life, there's something called natural philosophy that's just science. That's what we would call just like a science. I wouldn't even say biology. We just call that science today.
Yeah,
Back then, they called it natural philosophy. So he does that up to the age of like 14. He had this really influential guy in his life, Dr. William Small. This is a cool thing about Jefferson. Like, we know so much about him because just William Small is like a famous Scot.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was a pure Renaissance man. He was a professor. He was and Jefferson met him while he was at Williams and Mary's College. That's where Jefferson went to.
Yeah.
One of the
I think that's where Laura's sister used to work.
No, wow, that's a very prestigious college.
Yep.
I we saw the chat.
Yeah. The Mason School of Business.
Mason School. We need a sponsorship.
She's not there anymore. She lives here.
Williams Mary is a public college, which I always find to be like a random trivia fact. Yeah, seems. I think that's cool.
Right.
So Dr. Small super influenced Jefferson's life, right? He had a huge influence. He was like his personal mentor. He was his personal tutor. And I think it's really interesting because the person who influenced Jefferson was huge on mathematics and natural philosophy. And what's funny to think about this time is that a classical education didn't really cover mathematics, especially not mathematics in the way we think of today. I mean, calculus is like 100 years, not even 100 years old at this time.
Your biggest need for mathematics at that point is just for accounting practices, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there's.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be very curious to see maybe surveying. You'd
I was
use it for
going
that.
to say a surveyor probably have a pretty good grasp of it.
Yeah.
At least naturally, you would think, or geometry.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cartography, you probably Mercator projections probably use it.
Yeah.
This is a side note I was not prepared on. So, what becomes really influential is that if you think of Adams, or a lot of the founding fathers, but particularly think of Adams and Washington that we've talked about so far, a lot of their influence comes from traditional British Enlightenment. That certainly had an impact on Jefferson, but it wasn't actually his background, because Dr. William Small was steeped, and he was really just somebody who was consumed by the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment is more focused on like reason, well, and empirical evidence. Don't get me wrong. So, we just step back a little bit. When you talk about the breakup, and this is very, very broad, but you talk about breakup of European philosophy at the time, you had the continental philosophies, which focus a lot more on like logic and rationalism and reason. And then you had British style philosophy, which was think like Francis Bacon, which was empirical evidence. So there was, listen, they totally shared ideas and crossed. Anybody who thinks it was one on one side, one on the other, that's just a simplistic view of it. But Scottish Enlightenment was markedly different than your British Enlightenment because of that proportionally more focus on reason.
So it's less of like scientific method, like Newton developed, and more of like the old Greek way of doing it, where you just kind of thought it out. You do a lot of thought experiments like that.
Yeah, like logos, pathos, ethos, stuff like that. Yeah,
gotcha.
Which you'll see maybe that's where some of his, I don't want to keep using the word hypocrisy, but where some of his rationalism begins to play out in his policymaking, because there's a famous I forget which philosopher said it, but it was a critique of rationalism where a man could rationalize the prick of his finger to the destruction of the world. Yeah. Maybe that rationalism bleeds into a little bit of all men are created equal. Don't go to my farm.
Right.
So throughout his adolescence and childhood, he's getting tutored. He's getting all this amazing education. One of the coolest things is that, and I don't mean to like overly go on Small, but I just think it's really important, like, to understand the man who made Jefferson who he was, especially in intellectual capacity, was Dr. Small was like kind of really known for this super progressive teaching method of like wanting students to be curious about what they're learning instead of like,
that's progressive.
You sit there and have rote learning.
Right.
And Jefferson even said that it was the most formative experience and relationship he had in his entire life.
Basically just encouraging you to study what you find interesting.
Yeah, and to adapt a more tactile learning methodology. So yeah, and to end on the relationship between Dr. Small and Jefferson is that there's a lot of, outside of Jefferson, there's a lot of people who point at Dr. Small and say he was a bridge between Scottish Enlightenment and the American intellectual movement, the philosophes movement of the late 1700s. So, cool people you learn about as you go through this.
So you're taking us up to, that was 14. At what point does like the revolution actually start here?
So this is where it gets interesting. So his father dies in 1757, and he kind of ends his formal schooling. He ends his formal schooling at about 21 years old, because Dr. Small goes back to Scotland. So that's 1764. So about 5 years passes. He practices law for about 5 years. He mostly represents, it's like land disputes and stuff like that. It's nothing overly interesting. He works under this guy George Wythe, who's actually this like hugely influential attorney in Virginia who is known for like more like, I don't want to say constitutional law because that didn't exist at the time, but think more like public or policy law, not like, hey, figure out like who owns this property. But one of my favorite things about Jefferson during this time period is he's like essentially like the legal side of a debt collector. I like this idea of, Thomas Jefferson, who was the same height as George Washington, 6'2", so big guy for that time peried. He had strawberry blonde hair that he used to wear as a ponytail when he was a younger man.
That I find hilarious.
They're people. You do weird jobs when you're younger, like, right?
Right. But 6'2", debt collector's probably a pretty fitting role.
Oh, Kyle, that's a good point. I wonder if he physically collected the debt. He wasn't just doing the legal for it. He just shows up with like an axe.
Maybe you had to be a strong lawyer because you had to do it all. He's got to go actually serve the papers.
It's like Saul. I like that.
Right.
So Jefferson was always very politically connected his whole life, even as a young man.
It makes sense. Being that wealthy, you're going to have your fingers in a lot of pots.
Oh, yeah. He ended up hanging out with the governor when he was like 12, 13 years old. He met him and stayed close with him during his time in there. But to answer your question, he joins the House of Burgess in 1769. So there's 5 years of kind of practicing law. He was elected, so he's 26 years old. He gets elected to the House of Burgess,
what's the House of Burgess? Is this something that's UK, or is this something that we've set up?
Kind of. So it's essentially the British House of Commons. Virginia's House of Commons. So think very, very parliamentary.
So it's kind of like you not giving us a right to sit at the table. It's kind of like how the representation was kind of a big deal, right? So they're not letting them be represented in England, so they just decided to start one here, maybe to see if they can get that take off.
Yeah, I think like they started it, and the Brits were like, we're more okay with this because you get to play pretend. It's like give the little kid the fake phone.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The little lawnmower that.
I like that one. So he joins up, and we start to see some other. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are familiar with American Revolutionary history here. You start to see some famous names come around, like Patrick Henry. So he was part of the House of Burgess. So, and so I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it right because my accent's killing me. Burgesses. All right. I know we'll get flack from that. I don't want to get a correction early next.
It's not the bourgeois.
No. So he starts hanging out with Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, and they're just like super like they don't want to be part of Britain anymore. They want to have a revolution. They want to secede from Britain, and I always think it's kind of funny because the first thing they show up and the first thing they do, they're like, "Yo, let's just leave."
Right.
Everybody's like, "No, this is supposed to be a parliamentary procedure. We're supposed to see we can reconcile." He's like, "Oh no, we should just leave. We should just let's go form our own country."
And
out of the opposite
Jefferson. Pops up.
Which is ironic that the state of Jefferson was also fiercely, I believe, was supposed to be a free state. So that's kind of funny. Oh. All right, so he did two major things when he was in the House of Burgesses. One of them's really interesting. So he was a huge advocate of religious freedom. I mean, very big advocate. And also this kind of the first push of the separation of church and state. And where the term separation of church and state comes from, it's actually not from the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
That's like one of those misbeliefs.
It's like one of those four words in there, right? In like the preamble or something like that.
No, so the First Amendment, it's freedom from established religion, which refers to when Henry VIII forced everybody to basically be Anglican.
Because he wanted a divorce. Yeah.
So you get a divorce. That's literally, he got essentially what's the Medal of Honor from the Catholic faith, the defender of the church, and then was like, "Yo, I want a new wife," and the Pope's like, "No," and he's like, "I'm finding my own religion."
Anti-Pope, you.
So he was, but the term separation of church and state actually comes from a letter, I believe it's 1808, between Thomas Jefferson and the Danbury Baptist Church in Connecticut, where he talks about separation of church and state. Kind of talking about the contradictions of Jefferson, the other big thing he passed were these laws that restricted concentration of land ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, there was these laws basically saying that all the land would get passed on to like essentially like the oldest heir of the family.
Right.
And it concentrated wealth in land ownership, which is essentially wealth at the time, if we're being honest. I mean, there was a stock exchange. Sorry, but
That's how he got his wealth.
yeah, and actually passed laws and fought against the establishment of those laws. So, the walking contradiction, he got all his money from this, and he's the same guy trying to reduce it.
God, he almost sounds like a person that kind of hated himself.
Yeah, there's probably a little bit of that, dude.
Right?
Because what we're going to talk about throughout this is that he was in debt pretty much his entire life.
Right. As wealthy as everything was, one of the things we talked about when we got to Adams was that was the only founding father's estate survived. And I didn't realize that Jefferson was that affluent. So it must have been quite a fall.
Yeah, he was just in debt his entire life. Horrible money management. That's why he never freed. That's part of the reason he never freed slaves. Part of the reason he made some decisions he did.
Probably why he accumulated them.
Yeah, like you know, Kyle, you're right. Yeah. Problematically so, and we'll get more into this. Is that he had a very paternalistic view of slavery, which is obviously very horribly racist. But yeah, but then wrote all men are created equal. How you can't marry those two ideas. They're mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
So as we lead up to the Declaration of Independence, that was not Jefferson's first foray into writing nationally read papers. After the Coercive Acts were passed in 1774, so the Coercive Acts were basically like the Brits passed the Stamp and Townshend Act to raise money after the 7 Years' War, right? And then Boston was like, we're going to throw all your tea into the water, screw you.
Right.
And then, caused a riot that resulted in 5 colonial deaths, all that we covered under Adams, so we covered in the previous series. They passed these things called Coercive Acts of 1774. And these are kind of like not talked a lot about because it bleeds, literally, they're passed in 1774. Lexington and Concord, 1775. War goes off immediately.
Right. But
Jefferson, being probably still boys with Adams at this point, he authors a very prominent pamphlet called a Summary View of the Rights of British America. And it kind of lays out the rationale for how they should be treated. Now, again, this is before Lexington and Concord. So there hasn't been really any, horrible bloodshed besides the Boston Massacre, which, again, we all know how that went to the Adams series.
5 people. Massacre seems a bit of a hyperbole in that situation.
Are you telling me Bostonians are fond of hyperbole?
Yes.
Are you? That's the hardest thing my wife had when she moved up here. Is that everything's like it's taking 4 hours to drive everywhere. It's like it was 25 minutes. I don't know why you're yelling. Yeah, I mean it is kind of funny because it's like, hey, can you guys pay slightly more taxes for us protecting your interests? It's like, how about new country? I mean, I guess that's okay. So it really falls down into 5 points, and I'll run through them real quick. Because remember natural science, natural rights, talks about that a lot. He says basically British America should be able to govern itself or be independent. He critiques all the British policies, taxation with recommendation, the trade restrictions we had with certain countries. He straight up just is like, there shouldn't be a king. It's stupid you guys have a king. He doesn't say that verbatim, but it's as close to that as you're going to get.
See why he liked France so much then.
It was very funny. It's very funny because I read a fair amount of it. And he gets progressively angrier as you get through it. So,
does the writing get worse?
Honest, maybe, Kyle. I would love to actually see what it handwritten looks like.
Right.
He gets to a certain point and he's just like, you know what, we shouldn't even have British at all. The British authority shouldn't be here at all. We'll pay you taxes, but you should have no judges, no internal controls. You should just leave us alone.
So he started out with this paper of, this is how we can work together. These are the rights we should have. And you know what? He talked me out of it. We're leaving.
And he ends it with the last couple stanzas are basically let's call for unity. We are one country, and we should resist the British rule. And I love that he went from we should be autonomous and self-governed to kings shouldn't exist. Leave us alone. We should fight you. I'm like, whoa, dude. But yeah, it was hugely influential.
Gotcha.
So I was going to cover like some of his children.
Yes,
some of
I
the
think we
weirder
kind of
stuff
have
around
to
him.
go there. Yeah.
So Thomas Jefferson, he had 2 kids with his wife Martha Skelton. So Martin Skelton, she died really young. She died at like 26, 27. In the first one, Martha, who went by Patsy, you'll hear more from her because she became like, she was basically like the first lady-ish. She filled the first lady role for Jefferson when he became president. Mm-hmm. She was like super well educated. She was kind of, she was kind of awesome, if I'm being honest with you. Like she was kind of Abigail Adams-y. And then the other one, talk about Abigail Adams, this is the one who Abigail famously took care of when she went to England, which is Polly. Or Mary's her real name. She was the second surviving daughter, but what's kind of sad is that Jefferson and Martha had 6 kids together, and only 2 survived to adulthood. It was a horrible time.
I mean, that was kind of common. That's survival rate was, 30-40% of childbirth?
There's an interesting stat that if you remove people who passed away before age 5, the average life expectancy in the world
has not changed much.
Yeah, it's like literally only started changing in the last 100 years.
Yeah, if you made it to your mid-20s, I think it was pretty likely that you'd make it to like 50.
Yeah. Very, very, very sad. And he had 6 kids with his slave, Sally Hemmings, that we mentioned in the beginning. And this is obviously a very complicated topic. And, this isn't really the show that dives into the sociological aspect of this. I think I know I can't do that. I know Kyle would be better at me than doing this, but still probably wouldn't be.
Yeah, that's the only thing I can really want to say about that is I don't think it's very difficult to infer the type of character of a person who goes and fathers children with their slaves.
Yeah, it's complicated. But Sally Hemmings, she was... It even feels weird to say they had 6 kids together as if it was like some mutual, like, we're going to have kids together.
Right.
But I'll put it this way. Thomas Jefferson fathered 6 kids with her, and he was not a good father to them. No. Like, he wasn't. Now, what's interesting from a historical perspective, and I meant, Kyle, I mentioned it a little earlier, that, you read, this would be contemporary sources. It was always speculated, but actually in the late 90s, it was confirmed through DNA testing that these were his kids, which I think is kind of interesting when you read like papers from like the 1970s that just heavily inferred it.
Right.
And one thing, Kyle made a point to bring this up in the pre-show when him and I were talking, but the Monticello estate deserves a lot of credit for how open they are with this history. I mean, they are good historians. They are good Americans who talk about this horrible stuff because it should be talked about. This should absolutely be discussed. So, they had 6 kids. For 2 of them passed away young. He had Harriet Hemmings, and then the other child died so young they never named him. But here's where it gets really. In some previous episodes, I talked about my difficulty with Jefferson. Yeah. So he had the 4 kids who survived: Beverly and Harriet, and yes, just in case anybody's listening, the child that passed away when she was 2, they renamed the child born about a few years later Harriet also. Yeah. Which is weird. And I also want to make a timeline clear here. This is happening while he's president. Right. So 3 of these kids are born while he's president. 1801, 1805, 1808. So Beverly and Harriet, they were both Harriet who survived. Obviously, the term that's used here is they passed as white. So when they were old enough, they were allowed to leave the Monticello estate.
They had light enough skin tone to basically what you're saying. Yeah, correct.
And what's interesting though is, and for what it's worth, but a lot of historians note that Jefferson, he gave special treatment to his slave children. He educated them, made sure they were literate. And I just want to start off with, if any sentence starts with special treatment to slave children, you're not a good person. Like, no. It's not, like, That's not a good situation.
Slave and child are used this to describe the same child. Your child.
Your.
Yeah.
But Madison and Eston, who was the last two children he had with Sally Hemmings, they did not pass as white. And they were never freed. Jefferson never freed them. They were actually, but here's the thing.
They were
freed. Some revisionists. They were
Weren't
eventually.
They? Yeah.
Yes. You get some revisionary historians, some Jefferson apologists who will say, no, he freed them, he freed his slave children. I'm like, okay, you're already arguing from, you're fighting that battle from the valley if you're trying to argue about his personally being, his personal life and being a good person. If you're saying, correction, he did free them after he died. You're still crappy.
Right.
Yeah. It was Patsy. Martha freed them.
Yeah.
She had inherited her father's estate, was like, oh, what the my half siblings? Like, I don't know how much she knew about it, but she's like, what's going on here? And she immediately freed them.
Thank God for the women of the founding or revolutionary period, right?
Yeah, the founding mothers, definitely good track record. Like, genuinely, besides Martha, I like Martha, don't get me wrong, but sending essentially the National Guard to hunt down your favorite slave, dressmaking slave, was not a bright point in early Republic's history.
No.
But Abigail, awesome.
Abigail was amazing. Yes,
I'm a very big fan of Abby. Obviously, Patsy seems like she's down. I like her. I'm a fan. So, yeah, Sally died in I believe she died in I don't want to use the word captivity, but she died in slavery because it's a prisoner system. It really is.
Yeah. Regardless of what type is practiced, which I think you kind of talked about the differences in the first episode we did.
No, and again, I don't want to sound like this guy, but it makes me. You could probably see why I very much like Adams.
Yeah, he was the only one that seemed to have like a real. Like he lived what he said. He said what he believed. He believed what he said. He walked the walk. Like all of his actions reinforced your belief in him and his character.
Yeah, I mean, and he was fine being hated for it, and I don't. Yeah. Like, Jefferson was described as charismatic, but very, very introverted, very, I don't want to use the word shy, because he was a great orator. Like, he could speak, but very reserved, very internalized. I think he wanted to be liked. I really think, and I guess, people are people, right? You grow up being told you're better than everybody else. You grow up in this aristocratic family. You grow up with slaves.
Losing your dad, let's not discount, like, how much that affects a child, too.
Right.
Especially a boy. Losing your father is...
Yeah, young.
Kind of a big deal, yeah.
Yeah. We're not here to judge how it was, left to right. We're here to basically, this is a podcast that talks about presidential history and eventually the economics of this. Jefferson didn't have that much influence on the economy when he was 26. Wait till we get to the Embargo Act. That's going to be a fun one. Oh my God. Talk about having, you think with all that education, you would have picked up, Adam Smith's A Wealth of Nations and gone from there. But Kyle, I don't know if...
the crazy thing that it keeps blowing my mind thinking about it. All this stuff is happening during like the Enlightenment period over in Europe. Yeah. Never connected the two as happening concurrently. It's like they're two different worlds almost. Yeah, I mean,
all the founding fathers were, particularly Jefferson, was very influenced by Thomas Paine and John Locke.
Paine. Yes.
Very influenced by that. I like John Locke. He's one of those guys.
Lost, right?
Yeah. No. Lost. I was thinking the two treaties on government, but yeah, no. Also,
anyway, I think we probably got to the end of this controversial Jefferson episode 1. You can join us next week when we start picking apart the policies that define Jefferson's presidency, like the aforementioned Embargo Act that Eric's been just raring to get going on.
I really want to go on that one.
So in the meantime, what are your thoughts on Jefferson? Does he deserve his spot immortalized on a mountain, or would you swap him out for somebody else? You can email us at buckstartsherepodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit the website at buckstartsherepodcast.com to stay up to date. And we will see you all next week.